Well, it's 9 o'clock, my friends, and it is time to begin Memphis Theological Seminary Sunday. I am delighted to be with you again this week. My name is Carmichael Crutchfield. I'm the professor of Christian education, spiritual formation, and youth ministry at Memphis Theological Seminary, and it's my pleasure to be with you again today. And I'm going to share my screen and get started. But before I share my screen, I'm going to lift these books up. Last week I used John Roberto's book on faith formation 2020, and this week I'm using his book Faith Formation in the 21st Century. That's one of the books I'm using. One of the sources I'm using. A second source I'm using is Souls in Transition by Christian Smith and with Patricia Snell. And I'm using that in one of my classes this semester, and certainly lift that book up. Another book that I'm using is Julie Ann Lytle's book, Faith Formation 4.0. And I'll be using some of the work from there as well. And a third book is the book that I lifted last week, my own book, The Formation of a People, an African-American Christian Education in the African-American Church. And that's by me. And then lastly, Andrew Root, Dr. Andrew Root has this book, Faith Formation in a Secular Age. And so I'm using those books. I'm always accused in my classes of having too many books. And of course, we're not using everything from all of these books, but certainly wanted to share those things that we are sharing, where we're sharing from. With that in mind, I'm going to jump into this presentation here as soon as I get myself on here. Okay. We're going to start today, and let's begin with prayer. Dear God, we're grateful for today, grateful for this Sunday, this Seminary Sunday at Memphis Theological Seminary, and for those who are a part of this study and those who are the teachers and learners. We give you thanks, and we pray now your guidance and direction as we go forward on this time of together. Amen. We all know that the world is changing around us. We experience it every day. Sometimes we embrace particular changes and innovations and integrate them into our daily lives. At other times, we are confused, fearful, and overwhelmed. This pandemic has definitely lifted that for us. We are by the pace and enormity of the changes, and we wonder what impact they will have on us, our family, our community, and our future. Many Christian congregations and their leaders experience the same changing world and respond in similar fashion, embracing and integrating some changes while being confused, fearful, and overwhelmed by others. And then there are some congregations that deny that the changes are really happening or affecting them and continue to do business as usual. Many others respond by putting more energy and resources into tried and true programs or projects developed in an earlier era to address the changing world, only to the disappointed and discouraged when they don't produce the desired results. A smaller group of congregations and their leaders decide to reimagine church life and faith formation in the new world, developing new initiatives and projects. This is sort of where our study where I'm trying to take us in the study, is the whole sense of that last piece I just said, reimagining church life and faith formation in the new world. But in all of these changes, the thing that remains constant, one of the things that remains constant, is the end game is discipleship. Go there and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I'm with you always to the end of the age. And that is where I jump off most times when I start teaching. I started with discipleship. Um, but the faith formation is contextual. Uh, the models and approaches, the resources and technologies we use are suited to particular eras. 20th century faith formation models included the schooling model of education, and it became the dominant paradigm for church education as congregations organized Sunday school classes by grade level in school-like settings with textbooks developed for grade levels or age groups in 1-hour sessions organized around the school year calendar, and so on. So this became and has become and continues to be with many of our churches and congregations the model that we use, the 20th century faith formation models that is around these ideas that I lift before you. And so what happens in these contextual situations, it relies on the surrounding ecology for support and reinforcement. The 20th century model assumed a supported, multi-generational family faith practice and socialization, a supportive church culture, and people's participation in church life, especially Sunday worship. It relied on a whole ecology of faith-forming people and activities to support the hourly programming. Many Christian churches relied on the ethnic faith traditions of their faith people to transmit faith from generation to generation at home and church. And someone has said in Roberto's book, he says that just consider this, that someone who has been away from church for 50 plus years and walked back into a typical education program today would feel right at home because nothing has changed. So the challenge before us is the churches face a huge adaptive challenges for faith formation in the 21st century. Last week, I mentioned some of those, or I alluded to some of those when I talked about religiously, more people being challenged religiously, unaffiliated, and are not spiritual, but not and spiritual, but not religious. Declining participation in Christian churches, increasing diversity and pluralism in American society, increasing influence of individualism on Christian identity and community life, changing patterns of marriage and family life, declining religious socialization, increasing impact of the digital media and web technologies. As we enter and we are as we move toward and move in farther into the 21st century, these challenges challenge us greatly. So first one, increasing diversity in American society. In 1990, when I began seminary, Dr. David Hester, then the president of Memphis Theological Seminary and also a professor of evangelism, shocked me, and he shocked probably most of our class when he told us that most congregations were designed to be homogeneous, out of a homogeneous world, and therefore were designed themselves to be homogeneous. That means that people were just alike. There was really very little diverse population in the people. But in the past 100 years, congregations were built around ethnic groups, neighborhood or geography, demographic. And let me just say something in these regards, particularly when I think about urban churches, and I think about this, and studies bear this out all the time, is that oftentimes the church was built in the middle or part of a neighborhood, and people walked. Very few People had to drive because it was right there in the neighborhood, and the geography and the demographic and all of that was there for people. But now a change is taking place in the social landscape. People are living as far as a 10 decade lifespan. That means there are a lot of people who are living up to 100 years old. Statistics show the population ages 65 and older is expected to more than double between what was 2012 and 2060, from 43 million to 92 million, representing just 1 in 5 U.S. residents by the end of the period, up from 1 to 7 today. So in my classes today, in Christian education classes, my intro class, I always spend about a 3-hour session talking about the aging population, the seniors ministry, those over 65, because listen to what I said. 1 out of 5, 20% of the people will be there. Again, according to the Census Bureau in 2014, children ages 0 to 18 were 25% of the U.S. population. Adult ages 19 to 64 were 61%, and adults ages 65 and older were 14%. So things are changing. Not only that, we have a 5-generational society. And all we have to do is just look around us. We have the builders, or the silent generation, people born before 1946. We have the baby boomers who were born 1946 through around 1960, 64. We have the Generation X around 1961, 64 through 1979, they were born. The millennial generation, born between 1980 and 1999. And the I generation between 2000 and above. Generations have unique, and why is it important for us to know this? Generations have unique and distinctive identities that can be described by their relationships to institutions, relationship to authorities, family relationships, work-life balance, communication styles, technology usage, learning styles, religious expression. Again, I spent some time in my intro class talking about these things because they are the realities of which people face in churches today, and how each of those things that I just listed in less than 5 minutes, how each of those impacts what we do. The Pew Research on a survey, what makes your generation, the generations described, it talks about all of these factors that I gave, what makes each generation unique. But let me move to the other thing, ethnically diverse society and church. The United States is fastly becoming a plurality nation, which means that an ethnic group will be more than 50% of the population. According to the latest 2012 United States Census Bureau, and we'll soon have another one, there will no longer be a majority group as a non-Hispanic white population decreases in number while still remaining the largest single group. By 2060, the percentage of white alone Americans will decline from 63% to 43%. Hispanic Americans will rise from 17% to 31%. The Black population will rise to 15%. Asian Americans will rise to 8.2%. The number of 2 or more race Americans will rise from 2.4% to 6.4%. What does all this say to us? Well, one, I've been a proponent for a long time. And when I go into that 31%, or when I go into the rise of Hispanic Americans from 17% to 31%, that what I have been a proponent for a long time is that I don't know why, I have not understood why our public education system across the board in the United States does not require, starting at kindergarten, that children learn Spanish. And we are, and now our church as well, we're going to be left out in many ways. Well, let me go on though, but let me talk about family forms. There's no more thing Many people grew up with this idea of family was 2.3, 2.4 children and so forth, and two parents. Well, let me just read what Roberto says in his book. And by the way, Roberto's book's on Kindle, so that's why I did not lift it. A married couple, but you can find this anywhere. I mean, any place. He gets it from somewhere else as well. The diverse family forms, and there are 10 that I'm listing. Married couple with children, original biological family. Married couple with children, blended family. Single parent with children. Unmarried couple with children. Unmarried couple without children. Same-sex couple with children, married or unmarried. Grandparents and parents with children. Grandparents as primary caregivers of children. Parents with single young parents, young adults living at home. And then the next kicker, the decline of marriage. And the decline of marriage, and I will say something more about that in a few minutes, has an impact on what happens in faith formation because it has an impact on who's attending church. Statistics show that the large portion of people who attend church have some sense of marriage, and that decline has an effect upon the number of people who are involved in faith formation. So the next thing is the challenge, the impact of the digital technology. Social networks revolution, internet revolution, mobile revolution, network individualism. Barry Wellman talks about it. I lifted up last week Andrew Jersey's book, Beyond the Screen. It lifts that very well, network individualism, and helps us to understand more about why young people are involved in the technology, why they're texting, why they might be sitting next to each other, a whole lot of things that we gain from that issue. But just think about all of those. I mean, I don't even have to go into those. All of us are impacted by these revolutions, the social networks revolution, where almost daily, I mean, you can stay in touch with people 24/7, 365, the internet revolution, where you can check out things across the world, across the globe, very instantly, the mobile revolution, where the phones of some type, almost everyone has one, if not everyone. So all of these things have an impact, the impact of the digital technology. And so, but there's also the changing patterns of religious beliefs, practices, and affiliation. And one of those is the shrinking of married couples. Over the past 2 decades, we have witnessed dramatic change in the religiosity of American Christians, especially as evidence in the increase in the number of people who are now no longer affiliated with any religion. According to the Pew Research, this represents 20% of all Americans, and this represents 30% of those in their 20s and early 30s. The percentage continues to rise to 34% among the younger millennials in the early 20s. So this gives us cause to pause, of course. But the shrinking of marriages is also a cause of this. Religious involvement is softening because one of the most religiously involved demographic groups, married couples with children, is shrinking as a proportion of American society. Another demographic trend, more elderly people may be a countervailing force, since older people also are among the most religiously involved segments of American society. But one of the reasons older people are more religious is because more of them lived in traditional families when they were younger. As younger cohorts inexorably replace older cohorts, the elderly population will include more and more people who did not spend their adult years in traditional families. I'm seeing this more and more even in classes sometimes. I have a couple of people, each semester it seems that this happens, that there are a couple of people who are a little bit older, and you would assume, you make the assumption, that they grew up in the church because of their age. But you find out that they did not, because their parents, they came from parents who were not, they from single households, and there was not married couples. And so the pattern did not necessarily exist as was expected. Well, there are a diversity. There's a diversity of religiosity and practices of youth. The 3 C's of religiosity, Lisa Pierce and Melinda Lundquist in a book called A Faith of Their Own, says those 3 C's are content of religious belief, conduct of religious activity, and centrality of religion of life. And they say those are the 3 C's of religiosity: the content of religious belief, the conduct of religious activity, and then the centrality of religion to life. 5 main profiles are listed of adolescent religiosity. They are abiders. That's 20%, the highest levels of religiosity and practice. Adapters, 20%, high levels of personal religiosity. Assenters, 31% minimally engaged with their faith. Avoiders, 24%, believe in good. They believe in God, but low levels of religious experience. And then there are the atheists. 5% don't believe in God at all. So we see this diversity of youth and young adults, and we begin to ask ourselves some questions about what does this all mean? And this is where we're headed in the next part of this class. This time together here. Let's see. Let me go to the next slide. In a book that I mentioned earlier, Snell and Smith mentioned 6 types of emerging adults: the committed traditionalist, about 15%, who embrace a strong faith; the selected adherents, about 30% believe and perform certain aspects; spiritually open, about 15% are not committed but are receptive; religiously indifferent, at least 25%, either way, not invested in it; religiously disconnected, no more than 5% have little to no exposure; irreligious, no more than 10% have skeptical attitudes. So when we start talking about emerging adults, and when I'm talking about emerging adults, I'm talking about this age group that now we refer to as the ages between 18 and 25. And between 18 and 25, in my class that I'm teaching this semester, we've spent a lot of time and doing a lot of reading, including Souls in Transition, on this whole issue of emerging adults. And where they're in that in-between age, where in many churches and in many environments, those 12 to 17 are considered as children, not children, as youth or adolescents. And then from 18 to 35 or so, sometimes they all get lumped in young adults. But more and more research is helping us to see, even since the 1900s, that emerging adults is a distinct time frame between 18 and 25, when a lot of different commitments are being made, and a lot of different things are being done in that time. So I want to say a few things about that group of people, that group that are labeled that. First, 4 spiritual types. This is a study that was done in Canada. Hemorrhaging faith, why and when Canadian young adults are leaving, staying, and returning. The engagers are those who are in church on Sunday, and almost all engagers report having experienced God's love and answers to prayer. They are more likely to be female than male. Engagers generally report having opportunities to serve and lead in their local church and have attended Christian camps and mission trips. Their parents are most likely to have consistently lived out their faith at home and in a church context. And I'm going to put a pin in this for a minute because it's part of my um, thesis is to believe that sometimes the issues that we have in emerging adults are issues with whether or not they're engagers or not, is how well we have done formation at the adolescent stage. And that's a whole different story. And next semester, as a matter of fact, I'll be teaching a class on leadership formation in adolescence. And it's for this whole this idea of what are we doing to form leadership with our young people so that when they engage, when they move to their different stages in life, because leadership is not something that just people get off the shelf. I'm a proponent that it is formed in us, and I'll be talking about that then. But the second category, let me move to that, but that's I digress too much. Fence sitters, you can, as it might imply, attend church occasionally, but their attitudes towards church are still somewhat positive. Many have made life choices that conflict with the moral teaching of the church. And you know what happens then. They are likely to report having experienced God's love and answers to prayer, but also think it would be hypocritical for them to attend church. Most feel their church makes a positive difference in their community, but it is not as accepting of people as it should be. I give a quick example of this. I use this as an example often. When I first started pastoring a church, one of the persons in that church was having some issues, and I went to visit him. He was a young person. He would have been an emerging adult, not referred to at that time. But he said to me, Pastor, you know, I can't go back to that church because I made mistakes, and everybody at the church is perfect. And the reason he got that, of course, is that people sort of seem like that's the way people at church are, perfect. Most in the engagers, as I said, believe the church makes a positive attitude. But let me move to wanderers. 26% have left the church building, but have not yet shaken the dust off their feet. Their parents are likely to have stopped attending church, thus bringing their own attendance to a halt. They find church moral teachings incompatible with their lifestyles and almost never attend. Wanderers think church has a positive role to play in society, just not in their lives. Prayer and Bible reading are almost completely absent from their lives. Those who hold on to their childhood religious identity usually do it for the families. The rest are likely to have written off organized religion altogether. Wanderers are like most young adults raised as Christians, do not join other faiths. And then there's the rejectors, 15%, almost never darken the door of a church anymore. While they report having been raised Christian, have now say that they are atheists and almost all cut ties with organized religion. So when we start moving to the question of how do we make disciples forming faith in the 21st century with all of these challenges that are before us? We began by, as John Roberto puts in his book, we began by reimagining, thinking of how revitalization of the church's educational and formational ministry, believing that we can embrace new approaches that provide faith formation for all ages. And I believe we are blessed with new thinking about learning and faith formation. That's another, I believe, statement. And an abundance of new resources and digital media and technologies that can transform the way we do for faith formation. So it begins by starting with these 3 bullets lifted before you. The way of the head is to inform. The way of the heart is to form. The way of the hands is to transform. So that's where we begin in this whole sense of what it means of forming faith in the 21st century. By the way of the head, by informing, and as informing might imply, that is the knowledge that is important for us to give and to make sure that people have from generation to generation the religious transmission of the information from one person to a next. But more than that, we also must work towards the heart of forming the heart. And this is an important part of what it is in the mission of making disciples and forming faith, and then making the hand. I always say when I talk to people and when I do lesson plans in church school and stuff, that I'm always intending with the goal to do those three things: that inform, form, and transform, and helping the work that we do in the lesson to give some knowledge. And one of the goals is certainly the cognitive goal, but there's also the affective goal that moves to the heart, that makes the heart become formed in a different way and reflecting differently and thinking differently and moving differently. And then the way of the hands is the action that is taken as a result of that taking place. And this leads to forming faith in the 21st century, to belonging, behaving, and believing. Community being first. How do we make disciples and form faith? Today, most of us grew up with an approach that emphasized believing as the first step, then behavior, and finally belonging to a particular Christian tradition and community. Most of us are very familiar with this progression. Diana Butler Rice writes, for the last few centuries, Western Christianity offered a faith in a particular way. Catholics and Protestants taught that belief came first, behavior came next, and finally belonging resulted, depending on how you answered the first two questions. Churches turned this pattern into rituals of catechisms, character formation, and confirmation. At birth, Christian children were either baptized or dedicated with sponsors and parents answering belief questions on their behalf, promising to teach them the faith. As children grew, Sunday schools and catechism classes taught Christian doctrine and the Bible, ensuring that each generation knew the intellectual content of the tradition. Eventually, children moved from Sunday school to big church, where they participated in grown-up church practices and learned how to pray and worship and sing and give alms and act kindly. When a Christian child reached an age of intellectual and moral accountability, somewhere between 7 and 15, the church would offer a right of full membership in the form of communion, confirmation, or in the case of Baptists, adult believers baptism. Believe, behave, belong. It is almost second nature to Western people to read the religious script this way. This is Diana Butler Bass in her book concerning Christianity, and I can't remember the exact name right now. It's so long ago since I read that book. But what she's saying is that the church has remained in that, and part of the premise that's been argued about emerging church, about the whole idea that the Reformation and changes of churches take place every 500 years or so. And at the time that she wrote it, it was about 500 years since the Protestant Reformation. So, but this approach has led people to believe that religious commitment begins when one assents to a body or organized doctrines, that is, believing. and that the assent to beliefs precedes and takes priority over behaving and belonging. This pattern is changing. We are returning to a much earlier approach grounded in Jesus's own ministry. How about that? Jesus's own ministry. Long ago, before the last half millennium, Christians understood that faith was a matter of community first, practices second, and belief as a result of the first two. How do you know this? How do you know this? Jesus begins his ministry with belonging by calling together a community of disciples who were asked to leave everything and form a new community. I don't believe you find him asking him, do you believe anything yet? Jesus began with the inner life, the heart. Indeed, when he said, you will know the truth and the truth will make you free, he was not speaking of a philosophical idea or a set of doctrines. The truth is that the description of the heart was the ground of truth. Spiritual freedom results from a rightly directed heart and the self as it moves away from fear, hatred, isolation, and greed toward love. And as Jesus also said, love is shaped through a relationship with God and neighbor, steeped in self-love and self-awareness. Faith, truth, freedom, all of it is relational, not speculative. So in other words, I mean, all of the issues, and in the day and society in which we live, we have a lot of issues, including racial issues. And the truth is, and it's been said by many, that this whole sense of changing or transforming and moving in a different direction, it begins with community first, belonging. The early community that followed Jesus was a community of practice, a community of living the way of Jesus that was behaving. They listened to the stories that taught them how to act toward one another, what to do in the world. They healed people, offered hospitality, prayed together, challenged traditional practices and rituals, ministered to the sick, comforted the grieving, fasted and forgave. These actions induced wonder, gave them courage, empowered them, gave them hope, and opened up a new vision of God. By doing things together, they began to see differently and they began to behave differently as a result of that, and living the way, and in so doing, were followers of Jesus. The beliefs that guide us as Christians are embedded in the community's life, and the practices that give shape to the life and faith, belonging and behaving, lead to believing. In the biblical pattern of faith, believing comes last. Indeed, this pattern repeats in both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. From the calling of Abraham and Sarah through the great prophets and heroes of Israel to Jesus and the early church, those who walk with faith started by following, by becoming part of God's community, by enacting the practices of God's way, and finally by recognizing and proclaiming the glory of God. This is one of the reasons I believe that one of the things that what we're trying to do with children, with children through adolescence and on through their lives, is trying to help them build community first, belonging first, not trying to get them to take on a doctrinal thing so much, but to belong and for have community first. If you want to know what's one of the issues that we have with many of our young people today, is that many of them want to belong. They want community first. But oftentimes, if we're not careful, the church may not perpetuate the sense of belonging. I know all of you listening there, that's not true with you. It's just sort of what I know in my own experience. Community first, living the way, behaving, and believing followers last. So if you want to see that in the scriptural way, in Acts 2:42 through 47 is one of my favorite scriptures, like so many others are. But this was my favorite because when I started thinking about what is the church ought to be doing, this scripture always comes lifted to me. I see a raised hand. And okay. I see a raised hand. Is there a raised hand?
I am not sure, Dr. Crutchfield. I don't see.
You don't see it? Okay. I did,
Yeah.
maybe it was an accident. Okay. I saw something popped up, raised hand. Okay. I'll
Okay.
just continue. Okay. In Acts 2:42 through 47, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And because of time, I won't go through the rest of that scripture, but if you look at what happens after as they become community first, and the sense of belonging, you start seeing a behavior that takes place, the way they're living out a way, and then belief comes later. Well, faith forming processes will begin. They begin with caring relationships, growing in faith and discipleship through caring relationships across generations and in a life-giving spiritual community of faith, hope, and love in the congregation and family. Begins with caring relationships. And then celebrating liturgical seasons, growing in faith and discipleship by experiencing the feast and seasons of the church year as they tell the story of faith through the year in an organic and natural sequence of faith learning. Oh, I believe I'm a strong proponent of the liturgical seasons because what I just said then, because they tell a story or tell the story of faith through the year in an organic and natural sequence of faith learning. And then a third, celebrating rituals and milestones, growing in faith and discipleship by celebrating rituals, sacraments, and milestones that provide a way to experience God's love through significant moments in one's life journey and faith journey. I remember going back again to my MDiv years that one of the things that I learned with now the deceased, and of course Dr. Hester is deceased as well, the Dr. Paul Blankenship, who taught us that one of the things that the pastor has to make sure takes place in the church is that you got to celebrate the milestones with people, because these are significant events in the life journeys of people. And he went on to tell us some of those things, and it certainly has become and has been a part of my own ministry, pastoral ministry. Reading the Bible, simple. Growing in faith and discipleship by encountering God in the Bible and by studying and interpreting the Bible, its message, its meaning, and its application to life today. And I said all of that. That last part I said, I just was talking to a gentleman last night who likes to quote the Bible. And I'm sometimes leery of people who quote the Bible without much message or much meaning or any application for today, but just to quote it to say that's what they did then, that's what we must do now. I'm sort of skeptical about that. Learning the Christian tradition and applying it to life. Growing in faith and discipleship by learning the content of the tradition, the Christian tradition. And we want to make sure that's what we're talking about, the Christian tradition. We're not talking about traditionalism, some of the stuff that we do in churches. I'm not talking about learning those things. I'm talking about learning the Christian tradition and applying it to our lives. And then praying, devotions and spiritual formation. And then, of course, serving and justice. Growing in faith and discipleship by living the Christian mission in the world, engaging in service to those in need, care for God's creation and action, and advocacy for justice. For me, this is the crux of the matter when it comes to discipleship. That's what discipleship does for us. And then being formed in the faith, it leads us to this sense of belonging, this sense of behavior that moves us into an action that causes us, our hands to be transformed, to be people that serve and practice justice and work towards justice. And of course, last, worshiping, growing in faith and discipleship by worshiping God with the community of faith. Praising God, giving thanks for God's creative and redemptive work in the world, bringing our human joys and dilemmas to God, experiencing God's living presence through scripture, preaching, and Eucharist, and being sent forth on mission. So, earlier on, I talked about the ecology of the 20th century. And what I'm saying to us, and with the help, tremendous help from the work of John Roberto in the 21st century of faith formation, and other readings, and some of the readings that I lifted up earlier, and some of the other research around faith formation, a new faith formation ecosystem, intergenerational faith formation in the congregation, relying, pushing back some on the sense of age level, and really doing intergenerational faith formation in the congregation. But then at the same time, age group and generational formation in a variety of physical places and online spaces. I mentioned those different generations, 5 generations earlier. There is a need for us to have generational formation across generational lines. It does us good. It does the church good. It does all of us good to understand more about each generation, for all generations, to understand each generation and not just say, oh, they're different from us, but to understand but then family faith formation at home. I personally believe that, and I talked about these different family constructs earlier, that's where it all begins, by first understanding that the family has at least 10 different type of constructs, and that when we say family, we have to be able to articulate to people that we're not talking about people who are married, just the husband and wife and 2.4 children. We're talking about a broader spectrum of what family is, and what family faith formation is. I am convinced that one of the things that is missing and must be part of the 21st century is family faith formation at home, not at church, but at home. So that means curricula and all kinds of things have to be created to help people to work through faith formation at home. And then missional faith formation to the spiritual, but not religious, and the unaffiliated. Missional being that we move in a direction of touching the lives of people who say they're spiritual and say they're not religious, and may not be affiliated with whatever might be there that's before them. But that is the challenge, to missionally formation to the spiritual but not religious and the unaffiliated. And then online and digital enabled faith formation. What we're doing at Memphis Theological Seminary with these Sunday seminaries at 9 o'clock are an option, or options, and additions and enhancements to what we do in church school and what we do in worship and in other educational places. All of these are opportunities for us to do more and more faith formation. And that ends my share of the screen. And all I want to say at this point, as we are about 10 minutes away from the time that we end, I would certainly want to entertain any questions that anyone has, but I want to sort of end or end my talk in this way, say, to seek out, the faith formation requires that we seek out people and we boldly go in the 21st century. We need to be willing to seek out new, innovative approaches for faith formation that engage everyone, all ages and generations, in all of their diversity, and be willing to act boldly to bring those innovations to life. And I say boldly because there's always going to be resistance to change. That's just the way life is. Faith formation in the 21st century will need to create new models, approaches, resources, and tools to address the 4 big adaptive challenges that I described earlier. And it requires this new faith ecosystem that I described at the end of this presentation. So I'm going to stop my talk now and give you an opportunity if there are questions to be raised in these last several minutes that we have, last 10 minutes that we have together. In case there are, I'm certainly here to respond.
Thank you, Dr. Crutchfield. It's all very, very thought-provoking on my end. I feel like for every slide that you had, there were all these questions bubbling up. We do have somebody that asked about the data from the 6 categories of emerging adults.
Mm-hmm.
The 2 questions are, what's the date of this data, and is it changing rapidly? He says, my sense is the numbers are trending strongly toward the indifference end of the spectrum.
Oh, you're probably very right. This research was about around 2012. And yes, definitely so. And people are continuing to research. You just can't keep up with it. Yeah, I think the sense is absolutely right. And it is trending towards the indifference. And I think that it will continue to trend in that direction unless we come to grips on the other end of the spectrum with adolescents, and in many ways, in many places, those innovations and to do things boldly, more than just saying, when I say go boldly, I'm not just talking about putting computers in people. That is a part of it, but to see particularly this area about intergenerational, how that can make a difference, how that might make a difference in understanding everyone who's in the church and not just the generation of which we're a part.
One of the things I'm thinking about is how really what is essential to the Christian faith and also essential to the ongoing existence of the church in a meaningful way is that people contribute and they don't just receive from the church. I feel like, being on Zoom is really illustrative sometimes because in fact, I noticed this years ago when I worked at a church and we established an online campus. The numbers of people that were logged on would rise gradually towards the sermon. And then the sermon, you usually hit the max amount of people who were logged in. But as soon as the sermon was over, the numbers of participants would drop drastically. I think we're seeing that nowadays, that a lot of people are online. And I'm wondering, is that just because people really do think of the church as oftentimes the sermon being the thing that you're getting something from? They want to get something from it, and then they're good. Whereas really what we must have is you don't just get something, you contribute something. And I'm wondering, is that our consumerist culture, or is that just a natural human tendency to be like that? And I just wonder what the solutions are to that.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question that you have, because you sort of hit at it. 2 things that happen is the consumer culture has become so pervasive, and the individualistic culture has become so very pervasive. And as an individual who is a consumer, that's why you tune in with the part that you want, that suits you, or that you're looking to benefit yourself. And then the other part of it is that we have, and part of what I want to say on that, Nathan, is, and to others who are listening, is that I think the 20th century model of teaching, of the school, and it's part in my book. What I have a part of a chapter in when I talk about this is that this whole sense has taught us to be passive in our learning and passive in our, and that we just receive and regurgitate on tests, and that we don't really engage and see how the lessons apply in a way that transform us, that move into our hands. But we just become very passive. And even sermons sometimes, I'm preaching today from a very difficult text, because that I think that sort of a challenge for us is that Jesus is looking for more from us than just to say that we're saved and that we've been baptized. But I think sometimes we get a sense that that's what our job is on the other end, is just to receive and not to be active.
Yeah, I appreciate that response a lot, because I heard someone say at one time, it's not that it's not that we were baptized, but that
Yeah.
we are baptized. We are
Right.
baptized people. So, what does that mean for our identity?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is it?
Or someone say about taking the bread. Now that you've taken the bread of communion, now
Right.
what do you do?
Yeah. What do
You
you
know.
do? Right. Yeah. 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 And I think all along what Jesus, I mean, in that, what I was saying about belonging and following, and the whole thing that Jesus really wants us to follow him, and following him is, I mean, as I often preach and teach you, when you think about following Jesus, think where he went. He went to the cross. he didn't go to some place that of luxury. And so oftentimes that following is a place that we don't necessarily want to go.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's the thing too that is essential for everyone. We may differ on so many things about the way we believe, even about some of the ways we behave, and a lot of the time. But it's the following Jesus thing that is all. You never get that. You're never successful at that.
You
You're
never,
never
no,
good at being good.
never good at it. Never. Still working on it all the time.
I don't see any more questions coming through, Dr. Crutchfield. So
Okay.
if you
Well, good.
wrap, may do so.
Okay. Well, we will. You've
Oh,
seen the chat. So the chat.
there is.
Okay. Did you
Uh,
see things in the chat box, Nathan? Okay.
yeah, there actually did. There's one that came through just now in the chat box. Um, I often wonder whether all the choices about how we can spend our time makes this such a challenging thing. At one point, nothing was open at
Yeah.
night, let alone on Sundays.
Yes. But
Blessing and free will.
yes, free will. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. It makes a tremendous difference. I mean, but the one thing that has never changed, the choice for Jesus has never changed. It's just that we have other choices that are more appealing to our consumerist mind. If no other, I'm finished then. Hopefully those that have participated and been part of this, and know next week that Dr. Janelle Baker, a member of the Memphis Theological Seminary faculty, will be teaching for 2 weeks on her subject, For Thine is the Kingdom. We encourage you to come back next Sunday at 9 o'clock and to be a part of that study and continue. As you will see if you go online, the study is continuing on for quite some time, and we encourage you to do so. And as I said last week, we always encourage anyone who wishes to donate to Memphis Theological Seminary in a financial way, as the school always welcomes financial donations. Thank you very much, and thank you for being a part, and thank you for the opportunity to share.